While speedrunning is a competition between the player and the game, the rules of competition are defined by choices of the developers. A core aspect of speedrunning is making the most of what the game provides. Runners must leverage their knowledge of a game in order to maximize its potential. Devs create the goals that must be accomplished, the means by which they can be accomplished, and though unintentional, they also devise the manner in which these structures collapse. This is how developers break speedrunning. When developing a game, it's necessary to not only account for how things should be done, but also how they shouldn't. Even in circumstances where the correct path seems obvious to most, it doesn't take much before players begin ramming their heads into walls. To help avoid this, developers often put safeguards in place. This can be from an NPC providing hints or out-of-bounds detection pulling the player back on course. One of the most useful safeguards though can occur when the player gets stuck. If the character finds themselves unable to move, some games choose to do nothing, others simply warp them back onto ground, but there are a few that choose to launch the player into the air in an effort to troubleshoot the problem. When the game finds a player lodged in a tight spot or clipping into something, it gives the character momentum in hopes that it will get them unstuck. This is known as a proxy, and can be among the most game-breaking mechanics in games where the devs added them. One game whose speedrun is defined by its use of proxies is Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus. Sly 1 is a stealth platformer released on the PlayStation 2. With the exception of the intro and ending, each world is made up of a hub level that has 7 offshooting missions. Upon completing a mission, the player will get a key. These keys are used to progress through the world, with the first key unlocking the first part of the main hub, 3 being needed to access the rest of the hub, and all 7 keys being used to unlock the world's boss fight. Or, this is how it's supposed to be done at least. Of the 4 worlds where Sly collects keys, 3 of them can be completed with fewer than 7, and 2 being done with none. In order for this demolition to be accomplished, proxies are used extensively throughout the run. This is no better demonstrated than the World 1 skip. When playing the game as intended, 7 keys are used to unlock this cannon. Sly then proceeds to jump into the cannon, entering a cutscene which shoots him up to the blimp where the world's boss Raleigh is located. The thing is, the keys aren't needed to enable the trigger that plays the cutscene. Instead, the trigger is always activated, and the keys are solely intended to open the lid and make it accessible. When Sly gets stuck, the game will usually try to return him to the last place it registered him as grounded. In doing so, Sly is able to pass through otherwise tangible objects as the game tries to return him to a grounded position. Where Sly was last grounded does not immediately update though. Instead, when Sly lands while swinging his cane, his position will not be refreshed until his animation has ended and Sly is still on the ground. Sly is able to jump out of the cane animation though, meaning he's not on the ground when it ends. Since he fails to satisfy the game's criteria, it doesn't update his position. If Sly were to get stuck or jump into water during, the game will try to return him to his last grounded state. Since Sly's position hasn't updated though, rather than returning to where he just was, the game will send Sly all the way back to his last saved position, regardless of how far it is. All of this comes together to skip World 1. By setting Sly's grounded position behind the cannon and then chaining jumps, Sly can make his way over to water that's littered with floating barrels. One of these barrels has a particularly precarious position relative to the pathway. It's close enough that Sly cannot fall into the water, but far enough away that Sly can fall into the crack between it and the path. This leaves him suspended in freefall. The game then realizes that Sly is stuck in the air and tries to return him to his last grounded position. Of course, this is located all the way behind the cannon. When the game launches Sly back here, he phases through the cannon, triggering the cutscene and shooting Sly into the blimp. In doing so, Sly can skip entering 6 levels that are otherwise required, cutting World 1 down to just the entry level, the hub, and a boss fight. This is repeated in World 2. During the entry level, Sly makes his way over to the guard dog. When Sly is within range, the dog will charge at him, reaching the distance allowed by his post before recoiling back. By positioning Sly between the dog and the wall during its charge animation, when the dog turns to charge at Sly again, Sly will be squeezed between the dog and the wall, causing the game to launch Sly out at high speeds. This can, in turn, be used to cruise through World 2's approach level, landing all the way at the end and allowing for entry into the hub. Skipping this key would be useless if all 7 keys were needed, but as it turns out, the developer's fears of the player getting stuck can again be used to skip the hub. When approaching the casino's entrance, there's a rock pile beside a wall. By precisely angling Sly into the wall, jumping, and then swinging his cane, he can get wedged between the wall and the rocks, launching him straight up into the air and landing on the roof's narrow ledge. From here, Sly can walk along some of the invisible terrain before re-entering the level near the entrance to the boss fight. Clipping into this is similar to World 1's, with Sly's grounded position being set along one side of it, then moving to the opposite side without it being updated so that the game drags him through the trigger. Had the developers been less concerned with making the casual experience of the game as problem-free as possible, it likely would have been a much less broken speedrun. As irony stands, the same features that make the game more playable also allow for much less of the game needing to be played. Sometimes, skips and tricks make their way into a speedrun due to an abundance of concern by the developers, but other times, they're there out of sheer laziness. While video games are a medium for leisure and enjoyment for most, this only comes after a grueling development cycle. At the end of the day, the video game industry is a business, and businesses have deadlines. When deadlines need to be met, time needs to be allocated, with this often meaning that some problems need to go unresolved. By all accounts, the original Spyro trilogies are beloved classics and well-made games. That doesn't mean they're perfect though. Insomniac Games released the trilogy in a 3-year span, with only 11 months between the releases of the second and third game, as the studio was under a 4-game contract with Universal Interactive. With the end of the trilogy, and Spyro Year of the Dragon being made under such pressing time constraints, shortcuts had to be made. In 2018, members of the Insomniac Games team that developed Spyro sat down with the longtime world record holder of Spyro 3, Jeremy Thompson, to watch him perform a run. Oftentimes when it comes to speedrunning, the runners will never know why aspects of a game are a certain way. This format provided a unique insight into why different game mechanics function the way they do, as the developers have answers to things that would otherwise be simply speculation. Throughout much of Spyro 3's any % run, levels are entered by going out of bounds and reaching elongated hitboxes. This often requires gliding through textures that one would expect to be solid, but were instead intangible. During this exhibition, one of the developers would elaborate why this was the case.
Well, plus, like every collision polygon, like was costing you memory and speed, and so we had to take out anything that we thought you definitely couldn't get to.
Yeah.
In essence, the game was developed with a bend don't break mentality. Viewed in this way, it becomes clear that the game was developed to maximize the experience of the average player. By reducing the amount of data being spent on objects that wouldn't normally be encountered, it was able to be allocated to optimize the games in ways that most players would notice. That said, when the game is pushed past what it was designed for, there's very little resistance left keeping it from being completely torn open. This included making use of some things that the developers were aware of. Throughout the run, Jeremy would use many different types of proxies to save time. One of the earliest found variations of this is known as a squeeze proxy. By getting Spyro stuck between two objects, the game will shoot him into the air, which is used to allow him to glide to the end of the level. Upon seeing this being used, the developers would begin laughing. While making the game, they had stumbled across the glitch themselves, but decided it wasn't worth fixing. They had assumed that few people would come across it, and even if they did, it wouldn't give enough height to be useful. When working in such a tight time crunch, certain parts of the game needed to be prioritized over others. While most developers would love to release games with absolutely no bugs in them, decisions need to be made over what to fix. Something that's easy to come across or causes a game to no longer function requires much more attention than glitches that will never happen during normal play. In this respect, many speedruns exist in a gray area. Developers could have been aware of many glitches that make the game worth running, but chose not to patch them for one reason or another. They also may have explicitly designed the game to function that way, cutting corners with the belief that no one would be bothered to peel away the polished veneer to reveal the broken state below the surface. Of course, corner cutting and laziness can be fine when it's done by a talented enough studio, but that isn't always the case. After Insomniac finished their contract with Universal Interactive, they moved on from the Spyro franchise. Universal wasn't quite ready to do the same though. With the IP in their control, they set out to find a new studio to develop another Spyro game, eventually landing on Equinox Digital Entertainment and Check 6 Studios. Prior to working on Spyro Enter the Dragonfly, neither of these studios had ever developed the game, making this uncharted water with the amplified pressure of working on a widely popular franchise. As it turned out, Enter the Dragonfly would also be the last game either studio ever made. While the original trilogy was met with critical acclaim and commercial success, seemingly no one liked Enter the Dragonfly, with it prompting the founder of Insomniac Games to state that Spyro has become an abused stepchild, based on how bad it was. That said, the game's ineptitude led to the creation of one of the most infamous speedruns ever. Everything needed to happen exactly as it did for the game to be as broken as it was. In the original trilogy, each game featured multiple hub worlds that the player had to progress through before fighting the boss. The developers of Enter the Dragonfly opted to have a single hub world that the players would progressively gain access to as Spyro unlocked new breath abilities. Despite this, the portal to the final boss was in the initial section of the hub, within 6 seconds of where Spyro spawns. Naturally, the portal isn't unlocked from the beginning, but it isn't too far off. One of the abilities Spyro has is his head bash. By jumping into the air, Spyro can do a flip, orienting himself to land with his horns down before slamming into the ground. Normally, this is used to push buttons or attack enemies. In Enter the Dragonfly though, it also allows you to clip straight through the ground, where Spyro falls into the trigger to fight Ripto, which is both conveniently active and extends far outside of the walls of the hole. Now, one would expect that in a game where part of the gimmick is Spyro's ability to breathe more than just fire, he'd need to use more than just fire to defeat the final boss. Of course, the developers messed this up as well. The Ripto fight actually has a unique structure. The more of the game that the player has completed, the longer the fight is. By reaching 85% completion, a second phase is unlocked, which requires the ice breath to be beaten, while 100% completion will cause the fight to have a third phase that makes use of the electric breath. The speedrun enters the arena with 0% of the game finished though, causing Ripto to only have a single phase. In this state, Ripto creates an ice wall to protect himself from Spyro. Fire beats ice though, and Ripto has no way to combat this, leading to this being a 66-second speedrun, where nearly 30 of those seconds are loads and cutscenes. The long and short of Enter the Dragonfly is that it simply was not a well-made game. There are any number of changes that developers could have made that would have drastically changed the speedrun, anything from not putting the final boss in the first room to making better use of the mechanics that they added. Instead, the inadequacies of the game they made led to one of the most comically broken speedruns ever. These are all decisions that the developers made before the game got to the player though. Prior to consoles receiving an internet connection, the only way a game could be updated was to release a new version of the disc. This would fix any problems for players of the new game, but nothing could be done for people who already had the original. This would all change once developers could push out software updates in real time. Now, with bugs patched or content release, games could completely change overnight, meaning the speedrun had to change as well. When Minecraft was first released in May of 2009, it was largely a shell of a game. There was very little that players could do, much less a defined objective for someone to speedrun. Over time though, the game would receive a steady stream of updates, expanding the foundation of the game before releasing version 1.0 in November of 2011. Dubbed the Adventure Update 2, Mojang finally created a way to beat the game, leading to the birth of speedrunning in Minecraft. In the 12 years since, the way Minecraft is speedrun has changed drastically, with this being rooted in the decisions made by the developers. The basic structure of a Minecraft speedrun has generally been the same from the beginning. The player must find a workable seed, gather ender pearls and blaze rods, find the stronghold, enter the end, and kill the ender dragon. While the approaches and methods would change, the general trend of a run has remained the same. When 1.0 was released, speedrunning Minecraft was at its most bare bones. The first objective a player has after loading into a world is getting iron for a bucket. This required crafting up to a stone pickaxe to mine the ore and a furnace to smelt it. They would then need to find a lava pool and use it to create a nether portal. At this point in the run, the player needs both blaze rods and ender pearls, but which occurs next depends on whether it's nighttime or not. Since mobs only spawn below certain light levels, if it's nighttime, players stay in the overworld to hunt endermen. Due to spawn patterns, this was most efficiently done in desert biomes, making proximity to them a prerequisite to seed selection. If it was not nighttime, the player would go into the nether in pursuit of blazes. Blazes only spawn in fortresses, so once in the nether, it's time to set out looking for a fortress. After a fortress is found and enough blaze rods are collected, the player leaves the nether and obtains any missing ender pearls before then crafting an Eye of Ender. The Eye of Ender has a dual purpose. It both points the player into the portal room of the stronghold and is the key required to activate the end portal. Upon arriving into the end, the only thing left to do is to defeat the ender dragon. The most efficient way this can be done is through the use of beds. When a player right-clicks a bed in the end, it explodes, dealing a large amount of damage to any entity in its radius. During the fight, the dragon swoops down and tries to ram into the player, dealing damage and knockback. If the player right-clicks the bed while the dragon is over it, it will take a great deal of damage, with it requiring only a few beds to be defeated. Once the dragon is defeated, a portal will spawn that takes the player to the credits, and timing ends upon its entry. By and large, early Minecraft speedrunning was very straightforward. The developers gave the player very few options with to work, so their only options were to work efficiently within these parameters. This is how it would remain for a few updates. Update 1.1's big addition was spawn eggs, which are only accessible in the creative menu. 1.2 had the potential to slightly change the run with the addition of iron golems, but they do not spawn in villages upon world generation. The route would see a massive shakeup with the release of 1.3 though. The big change of this update was the addition of villager trades. While this isn't immediately relevant, keep it in mind. 1.3 also introduced a very important structure to the game, desert temples. Desert temples are a lootable structure that contain 4 chests. Among other things, these chests can give the player ingots. Additionally, they contain 9 TNT, which can be used to quickly gather blocks. The most important change though is so insignificant that at first glance, it doesn't even show up in the patch notes. In order to set your spawn in Minecraft, the player needs to interact with a bed. Prior to 1.3, they had to sleep in the bed. Although this may seem like a small difference, it has huge ramifications on the run. By sleeping in the bed, the game skips the night, forcing the player to wait through another day cycle before they can gather pearls. Now that beds only need to be interacted with, a player can set their spawn and have it remain nighttime. This comes together to create a rather unique strategy. Runs now entail players gathering the initial materials from a desert temple, entering the nether, obtaining blaze rods, then returning to the overworld for the night. They then build a large tower that is accompanied by a deep hole and then set their spawn at the top. Minecraft will not naturally spawn any mobs within a 24 block radius or outside a 128 block radius of the player. By standing at the top, the entire ground is outside the 24 block radius, while limiting the 128 block radius to not be as far. The player can then wait for endermen to spawn, look at them so they become hostile, lure them to fall into the hole, then the player dies to respawn at the top and repeats the process. This greatly streamlines killing endermen, as spawns can rapidly be refreshed. The rest of the run remained the same, with the player then crafting Eyes of Ender, locating the stronghold, and killing the Ender Dragon. This base structure would remain the same up through 1.7, before undergoing the single most radical change the Minecraft speedrunning route has ever seen in 1.8. While villager trading was added back in 1.3, it would not see its way into speedrunning until 1.8. This version saw a total overhaul of the trading system. Prior to this, villagers only had a single trade in the beginning, with the rest needing to be unlocked. Now, 2 to 4 trades are available to start. This greatly increases the likelihood of a useful trade being present. Additionally, there was more randomness added to the trading system. The system introduced in 1.3 had a much more regimented order, so unless you needed one of the opening trade items, you would have to unlock new trades to get the one you wanted. The added randomness of the 1.8 system allowed more desirable items to be available from the very beginning, especially with the additional early trade slots. The run would still begin by finding a desert temple and collecting its resources, but after this, it becomes pretty unrecognizable for a while. The next step is now finding a village. Once here, the player needs a cleric villager who trades Eyes of Ender. When the player has gotten enough emeralds from other trades, they'll get a single Eye of Ender and go to the stronghold. They then must find the library and mine the bookshelves. Upon a sufficient number of books being collected, the player returns to the village, trades the books for emeralds and emeralds for Eyes of Ender, before going back to the stronghold and finishes the run as usual. This overhaul of the trading system completely changed the structure of Minecraft speedrunning in a way no player could. The entirety of the Nether was now able to be skipped, all thanks to the changes made by the developers. Except 1.8 would be the only version this is possible. 1.9 would see the removal of being able to trade for Eyes of Ender, and a reversion to the tower strat. This wasn't the only issue though. While the base route was back to entering the Nether, finding a fortress, getting blaze rods, towering for ender pearls, finding the stronghold, and killing the Ender Dragon. These last 2 steps weren't exactly the same anymore. Locating the stronghold was now a much slower process. In early versions of Minecraft, only 3 strongholds would spawn in a world, but 1.9 would see the number increase to 128. This increase corresponded with a change to how strongholds were generated. Previous versions saw strongholds generate roughly between 400 and 1200 blocks from spawn, but this range was increased so that the closest strongholds were between 1200 and 2600 blocks away. Even once the stronghold was located, there were more changes to be had. 1.9 saw a complete overhaul of the end. While most of these changes were only accessible after the dragon was slain, the fight itself was radically different. Previously, the dragon would swoop down and batter itself into the player. Now, the dragon would perch on the exit portal, providing the player with a stationary target and completely changing the approach to the fight. This would roughly remain the way Minecraft would be speedrun until the release of 1.13. This version would see the addition of ocean structures. While this may seem insignificant, they have one massive benefit: loot chests. These chests can contain ingots like iron and gold, but most importantly, emeralds. Although 1.9 would see the removal of the Eye of Ender trade, it was replaced with one for normal ender pearls. This was largely ignored in subsequent versions, as emeralds took a significant time investment to gather, and trading for ender pearls still meant that the nether had to be visited for blaze rods. By decreasing the time it took to collect emeralds though, this process could be completed more quickly than using the tower. The route now entailed finding seeds that maximize the proximity to loot chests and getting enough emeralds to get all the necessary pearls. The next big change to the route would come in 1.16. Now, it was the Nether's turn to be updated. This update saw the addition of a new structure and mob that would both completely revolutionize the run. Piglins are a semi-neutral mob with a unique property known as bartering. If the player gives a piglin a gold ingot, they'll examine for a few seconds before giving the player a random item in return. One of these possible trades is for ender pearls, with the player receiving 4 to 8 ender pearls in exchange for their gold. This is something of a mixed bag though. While gold is much easier to come across than emeralds, villagers offered certainty. If the player completes a trade with the villager, they're guaranteed the item they want in return. In the case of piglins, there's only a 4.73% chance that any piece of gold will result in ender pearls. This problem is largely resolved by another addition new to 1.16. While piglins can spawn in multiple biomes, they also spawn in structures known as bastion remnants. Scattered through bastions are potentially dozens of gold blocks. Although the odds of a single ingot resulting in pearls remain underwhelming, the chances of getting a couple good barters were much less daunting when you had dozens of attempts. While blaze rods still needed to be obtained normally, this update would have another game-changing inclusion, again by the way of piglin bartering. In addition to trades for pearls, piglins could also give the player obsidian. This obsidian could be used to create a second portal. Since 1 block in the nether is equal to 8 in the overworld, it's essentially 8 times faster to move in the nether. By traveling in the right direction, creating a second nether portal could be used to drastically reduce the time it takes to reach the stronghold, and potentially even arriving directly in the stronghold itself. This is largely where Minecraft speedrunning stands. Future versions would follow approximately the same route, but with minor changes to make them slower. 1.16.2 and after would feature changed bartering odds, with the chances of receiving ender pearls being reduced from 4.73% to 2.18%. This version would also see the addition of piglin brutes. Easily one of the most fierce mobs in the game, piglin brutes spawn in bastions and deal massive damage to the player while also refusing to barter. The game's height limit would be increased in 1.18, with blocks now extending below 0. This would in turn cause the strongholds to spawn deeper down, making them slower to reach. In all likelihood though, this is not the final iteration of Minecraft speedrunning. The game continues to receive updates and the developers continue to add features. Eventually, this will again change the way Minecraft is played in a way that players and speedrunners can't on their own. But what if the developers intentionally add a glitch into the game? Surely no one would do this. Ty the Tasmanian Tiger is a platformer released on 6th generation consoles in 2002. By 2016, the remastering craze was well underway, leading to the game being released on PC that year. The game wasn't simply a port though. Instead, it was rebuilt from the ground up, meaning that just because a trick or glitch existed in the original does not mean it would work on the new version. As it would turn out, the remake proved to be way more broken, but it wasn't that simple. The game would not truly break until a patch was released in January of 2020. One ability that Ty has is being able to dive into the water to initiate a swim. While playing, there's an invisible box that's always in front of Ty that's checking for water. When this box finds water, the game allows Ty to dive. Where this begins to break though is when water extends outside of the playable area. The box isn't supposed to go through solid objects, but since it begins in front of Ty, it's possible to line up against the wall so that Ty is on one side while the box is fully on the other. If the water plane extends far enough outside the inbounds area, the game can read this water as valid to dive into, allowing Ty to begin swimming on land. This is where the theory that the developers intentionally added a glitch begins to take form. While the swim box has always functioned in this manner, early versions had a safeguard to prevent ground swimming. Previously, the game would constantly be checking to ensure that Ty was still in water when he was swimming. If he no longer was, Ty would exit the swimming state. In addition to existing in Ty 2 and 3, this check was present for over 3 years before suddenly breaking when the game received a patch in January of 2020. This patch saw the code relating to water be reworked to address a problem in the level Bridge on the River Tai. Here, one of the missions is based around learning how to dive. Located just below the surface of the water is a crate that Tai is supposed to dive into and break. In previous versions of the game, this proved to be a bit finicky. The button combination that's used for diving is also used as an attack. When done near enemies or crates, Tai will instead bite rather than diving into a swim state. While this was a minor problem, the developers decided to address it. Instead of moving the crate lower so that Tai would enter into a swimming state instead of biting, they opted to change how water functioned. In doing so, the developers introduced ground swimming into the game. Ground swimming is exactly what the name suggests. Tai continues swimming despite being on land. In doing so, they completely broke Tai's speedrunning open. Tai moves faster swimming than he does walking. In maintaining a swimming state, Tai functionally has a speed boost through areas he would normally have to walk. The property that truly breaks the game is swimming's ability to scale walls. Since swimming requires a full range of motion, Tai is able to make his way up terrain that's not possible for him to walk up. The only caveat is that he must not go too far above the ground, as doing so ends the ground swim. This comes together to skip the last third of the game. In Tai the Tasmanian Tiger, the game's levels are centralized to a hub world. Each time Tai beats a boss, he's given a new elemental boomerang that can be used to unlock a new section of the hub. The final boss of the game is locked behind this door, which requires the Zappy ring to power the generator and open the door. Ground swimming bypasses this requirement. By positioning Tai against this wall, his swim box is on the other side. Since the map's water extends beyond the playable area, Tai is able to dive and activate a ground swim. From here, Tai can swim up a tree that's close to the gate. The tree is on an angle, allowing Tai to swim up while remaining close enough to the ground that he stays in a swimming state. Once at the top, he exits ground swim and hops over the gate, entering the final level. The ground swim can actually be performed from the very beginning of the game. The only reason it isn't used is due to other elemental boomerangs being needed to complete the boss. The turrets require Frosty Frang to freeze them, while the flame ring is used on these pipes and wires. Since nothing in the fight necessitates the Zappy ring though, ground swimming allows a third of the game to be skipped, in addition to being used throughout the run in nearly every level. Despite being the most broken trick in the game, ground swimming was almost never included. The original game was released in 2002, but it was not until 2020, after a remaster and 3 years of updates, that the developers introduced the glitch into the game. Whether this was the devs fixing one problem to create another or an intentional inclusion will likely never be known. What's certain is that speedrunning Tai changed drastically because a few changes made to fix a small problem led to something completely game-breaking. Let's zoom out a little though. In all aspects of life, intent and reception are often at odds with each other. When Diocletian came to power near the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was in a rough spot. 50 years of rebellions and civil wars had left the nation divided and unstable. Over 25 emperors had failed to find solutions to these issues. It wasn't until Diocletian that stability would be fully restored. Through a series of reforms, Diocletian constructed the basis on which Rome would thrive for the next century and a half. While he was successful in ways not seen in generations, his reign did have its failures. One point of concern Diocletian had was inflation. Dozens of emperors minting their coins had led to the debasement of the Roman currency. This led to rising prices that far outpaced wage growth. To combat this, Diocletian enacted a rather creative law. He would issue the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD. As the name would suggest, the focus of this law was to set a maximum price on goods. Over 1,000 goods were listed, with the cost of things like wines, clothes, animals, and even labor being included. The thought behind the edict is simple. If the price of goods cannot increase, people's buying power will remain the same and the currency will be stabilized. There were many glaring problems with this idea though, not least of which was that it was completely unenforceable. The government would need to monitor every sale and transaction, or require the submission of detailed and accurate record-keeping books. The entire crux of the edict relied on the idea that people won't do something simply because they're told not to. Not only would this not address inflation, it also may have worsened the problem. Since the cost of living is not universal within a city, much less an entire empire, it was impossible to set a price that is equally sensible throughout the nation. A price that was affordable in Rome may be too high for the people in the Levant, while payment considered generous in Iberia could be starvation wages in Egypt. In the end, the edict was ignored by the people. The relationship between a developer and a speedrun is not too dissimilar. A developer may have every intention of having something done a specific way, but they lack the ability to enforce their will. Features designed to improve the quality of play can completely break a game. Updates meant to provide more content lead to less of the game needing to be played. Patches that solve one problem end up creating several more. Whatever the intention may be is irrelevant to the outcome that arises. The role developers play in speedrunning is both central and inadvertent. Few developers consider how their choices will impact the way their game will be speedrun, but these choices are what go on to define everything about it. The smallest of decisions can have the biggest consequences when so many games exist in a state of doing what was never intended to be done. In the end though, for all the handrails and walls that are put in place, how the game is played is ultimately up to the player. If you made it this far, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. These videos take a long while to make, so any support is widely appreciated. Thank you, and see you again real soon.